tardes,
Good
compañeros.
afternoon, brothers and sisters. Welcome everybody to this continental forum that's been called Weaving Public Education that Transforms the World. 2020 happened in the midst of a very deep crisis of the capitalistic system and a pandemic that is currently leaving all educational workers facing very precarious working conditions with greater labor vulnerability. And for all of our students, it's meant a deepening of educational exclusion that already existed beforehand in educational systems. We know that there are different perspectives that can witness to this fact, and bear witness to this fact, and that is why IDEA Network, REDCEPA, we started a dialogue through a series of webinars called Public Education in the Times of the Pandemic. The purpose of this has been, aside from identifying core issues, to define a series of proposals that would bring center stage the subject of what is the education we need to move towards to in the new reality that we're living in, which definitely has to be different. And we need to bet on a education for emancipation. So this work was meant to promote the action of educational communities from the grassroots, to create networks, to strike up alliances and come up with collective actions so that there was a horizon. And therefore, IDEA Network, all throughout 2021, we had a continental campaign of struggle that was called Against Educational Inequality and Emancipating Education. This campaign had the purpose of tackling to two different levels that actually became three. The first one was the identification of the trends that public education is now facing when dealing with ITCs that are highly excluding, lack of internet access, lack to information technologies, which varies according to social class, income, geography. And we've known for a long time that technology is not neutral. It can influence, it can bias, it can determine pedagogical practices. The other one was a creation of awareness and a creation of a fight agenda so as to be able to respond to the question, what is at stake for education? For education as a social process, for the public school as a space of collective forces, public education as the path for emancipation. And the third axis, which is the one of weaving solidarity and action networks, is expressed and it is evident in this present event. There are multiple efforts that are being made, and today is one of them. Now that we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Paulo Freire, IDEA Network wishes to contribute with its grain of sand so as to be able to achieve those objectives. That's the reason of being for this forum. We thank the participation, the enthusiasm of all brothers and sisters from the members of IDEA Network, of our dear friends from Estrado Network, and the Network for Teacher Works in Latin America. Today, there are representatives from all over the continent, starting from Canada all the way down to Argentina. Unions, teachers unions, educational workers unions, students unions through OCLAE, the Caribbean Latin American Organization of Students, academicians, students, activists, grassroots organizations in the defense of public education. So if you've seen on your program and you have not seen it, you'll need to see it. We will be working in two-hour sessions on Wednesday the 20th today and Thursday 21st, that is tomorrow. There will be a keynote presentation in the beginning. Then there will be 3 simultaneous workshops with different subjects in the agenda. 2 of them will be bilingual with simultaneous interpretation. One of them will be only in Spanish, so you'll have to look for that in your program. And tomorrow we will conclude with a plenary session in which we will present a report of what happened during the workshops, and we'll hear the proposal of a political declaration to put forward for your consideration. So as you know, there are very important fights that we need to fight in this continent, and so there will be many special requests for solidarity actions. So we ask you to send all of those requests in the writing to the coordinators of this event. We need to be very precise in the use of our time so that we are able to achieve our objectives. So brothers and sisters from Mexico City, I wish I could do this in person, but anyway, I send you a big, fraternal, loving hug of solidarity that expresses the strong will of men and women who belong to the IDEA network. And without any further ado, I pass the floor to Maria Ramos, so that she can give us some logistic announcements. Thank you, Mariluz, and welcome everybody. Just in terms of some explanation of how we will be working today and tomorrow, we will start with this plenary session. Andre Gaikon and Roberto Lejer will be sharing with us their perspectives, and after they speak about educational policies in the present time, we will go to work in 3 breakout sessions, 3 simultaneous panels. And in terms of those panels, as you were able to see on the program, we will always go back to the analysis that was the intention for this forum. So it is up to you to decide where to go for the workshops. Panel 3, it is the one about on education, pandemic, technology, education, and the pandemic. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of it. It's called Education, Technology, Pandemic, and the Right to Education. Sorry about that. So during this panel, we will have to go out of this session for that specific panel. If you wish to follow that discussion, we need to go to another Zoom link. We will be letting you know where to join if you want to join that specific session. The rest stay here. We will be letting you know about the discussion guidelines we will be working on. And if there are any questions or any comments that you might have all throughout today, we will be offering you to ask your questions on the chat so that we can give follow-up to them. And let me remind you that we have simultaneous interpretation services. To the right, you'll find the globe icon, so you can choose either in English or Spanish. So that's all on my side, and welcome everybody. Pleasure to have you. Thank you, Maria. So let us begin. I wish I could mention everybody's names, the names of all the people who are here with us on the call, but we'll have to do that little by little. So I'm not going to fall into the temptation of a round of introductions. Let us begin with the first of our speakers. As you will see on the program, the title of this conference is Educational Policies in the Times of the Pandemic, Regional Trends,
Recording in Progress.
Public School. So as you might know, we only have 1 hour for this conference. So our speakers will have 15 minutes each, and afterwards we will have a Q&A so that we can further that discussion. Either you can send your questions via Facebook or YouTube. In Facebook, we are broadcasting in Spanish. On YouTube, we're in English. So either language is fine. And you can also send your questions here on Zoom. But anyway, it is a great privilege and honor for me to introduce our speakers of the first panel. Dr. Andre Gassois from Canada, She is the research head of the British Columbia, the BCTF organization. She has a PhD on educational studies by the British Columbia Education, and she has broad experience in research matters as well as educational programs in different communities, including the work in Gabon, South Africa. And especially, let me highlight that she is a woman who's fully committed and convinced that the only path for us to transform our societies with democracy and social justice is by means of an education for liberation, and international solidarity comes first. So, Andre, thank you. She will be the first presenter. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Maria Luz, and hello to everyone. I'm joining today from Vancouver, which is the traditional unceded and stolen territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in Canada. And I'm going to share my screen. And what I'm going to do in the time that I have is really focus on global trends and some of the global pieces that have come up during the pandemic, but that are building on trends that have been happening within neoliberal policies for a while. So someone can give me, I think that's all set up. So oh, sorry, I just have to get on the right. There we go. So in line with the theme of this conference and with the discussions that we've been having throughout this IDEA campaign, education is a struggle. And that's, for decades, centuries, education has been a struggle. And at the heart of the struggle, questions that I've been looking at and analyzing is this question of what is taught. So we can think about that in terms of official curriculum or other alternative pedagogies, knowledges, what is taught. And the second struggle is how teaching happens. How is the work of teachers conceptualized and thought about? Is there autonomy? Is there room for judgment? Or are there spaces where it's trying to be controlled? And what I'm going to focus on in this short presentation is how the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development has sought to define these two questions in a very specific way, and to trace that through several interventions that they've made in the past, that they currently have going on, and that they see happening in the future, especially in the wake of COVID. So just, I'm guessing many of you are already familiar with the OECD, but as background, the OECD is a global international organization that was formed and is rationalized by the demands of global knowledge economies. There is an assumption through all of the work that standardization is both possible and desirable. We can come up with a global standard, let's say, that every country can aspire to. Which of course, in their view, can be generalized across languages and cultures. And what you'll often hear when the OECD talks is they'll talk about making it locally relevant or taking into effect local context. But that's always an add-on to this global discourse and global context. In doing so, it's masking its own cultural assumptions and expectations, this Western neoliberal mindset and knowledge system that's being pushed through within these discourses and policies. And ultimately, these educational initiatives are being used as a governance tool. They are seeking to shape educational policy and what I'm going to argue in the presentation is practice throughout the world. Whether or not your country is a part of OECD or not, it's seen as this umbrella that's shaping the overall global common sense of education. So the 3 points that I'm going to talk about are first, the Program for International Student Assessment. And that is a standardized test, a global standardized test. The IDEA network has been engaged in challenging and talking about for 15, 20 years, probably since 2000 when it was conceptualized. The second point, and I'll go into detail on each of these. The second point is Education 2030. This was an expansion from standardized testing to more broadly, how do we conceptualize and talk about education? And in the phases of this project, you see a global learning framework. So think about that, what is being taught, as well as common principles for instructional design, how teaching happens. And that has been an explicit shift into those areas. And then what I've been looking at recently is how the OECD has really harnessed the pandemic as an opportunity to push forward digital technologies as a way to push forward this agenda in new, maybe not new, but accelerated ways. So I'll touch on each of these briefly. The Program for International Assessment, as I said, started in 2000, and it's administered to every 3 years to 15-year-olds around the world. And this is their description of it, designed to gauge how well students master key subjects in order to be prepared.
Que también los estudiantes dominan los temas que estudian.
So the initial focus in these tests.
El enfoque inicial de esta prueba se enfoca en las matemáticas, las ciencias y la lectura.
Sorry, I'm hearing the Spanish translation and I'm not sure why. I don't know. I will just
pasando al canal de inglés.
Is anybody else having trouble with the interpretation, or is it okay? No, it seems okay. Okay. But what happened recently is that there has been an expanding focus. So from kind of what were called the reading, writing, and arithmetic type of hard academic skills, very much in quotations there, they've started focusing on complex problem solving, global competence, collaborative problem solving. So this is an expansion into other ways of influencing and making those type of skills into measurable skills that can be traced within these global discourses and global goals. And so the goal through all of those has been and is very explicitly to shape educational policy. And what's been happening recently, this author speaks about it as it's a new space of governance where you name and link what's in the mind, what can be taught with economics. So this expanding focus of how we can control all of these things. Perhaps the second point then is where that has been mobilized by the OECD. So if it was testing, now they've moved more broadly into educational systems and the conceptualization of education. And thinking of those questions I introduced this with, the what and the how, those are the questions that the OECD Education 2030 project is seeking to answer. They ask what knowledge and skills, attitudes, and values do today's students need to thrive in the world? And how can instructional systems develop these knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values effectively? And what I think illustrates some of these tensions is an example from our context in BC. So in 2019, which was the launch of the second phase where they're turning more to instructional design and what this looks like, British Columbia was chosen to host a conference for the OECD. And British Columbia is being celebrated as an example of what this can look like for other countries around the world. And so we had people from the BC Teachers Federation and teachers who are working across the province. We had several representatives go to this conference. And I want to paint an image for you because I think it really illustrates the tensions within this discourse very, very powerfully. So there was a stage set up at the front. And at the backdrop of the stage was beautiful Indigenous artwork that had been contributed by communities to be there. And throughout the presentations, there was acknowledgement, similar to what I did at the beginning, acknowledgement of territory. There was a discussion about integrating Aboriginal ways of knowing and what that means in BC and a celebration of that work that has happened in BC. And then when it got time to launch the program, an official from the OECD stood up on the stage in front of this backdrop with all of this context and said, just like the great explorers sailed across the ocean, bringing new knowledges, this project will help us navigate new educational landscapes. And to me, that just illustrates the appropriation that is happening at this moment, where with this expanding focus, they're celebrating things in BC like the infusion of Aboriginal knowledges, but it's ultimately being celebrated so that they control it and put it back into these boxes. And a group of our teachers who were at that conference, they have since come up with a workshop that they have developed and is being offered to teachers across the province called Engaging Members Through Professional Issues, Unveiling the OECD's Global Policy Agenda for BC Public Education. And what they're doing in this workshop is destabilizing the discourse and looking at the impacts within the BC context and the implications for teachers' autonomy, professional judgment, and what we want to celebrate within public education in BC. So that's Education 2030. I'm going to turn to the third point, which is the increasing focus with the pandemic that has allowed the OECD to really focus in on digital technology as now the mechanism for this vision that came up through Education 2030. And in this recent outlook, I believe it was published in August, they asked, what have we learned from the pandemic? Digitalization opens up new possibilities for education, and technology has the potential to revolutionize education. So again, here's that appropriation of a lot of the struggle language. And what they see when you look through the document, my analysis, there's kind of 4 lessons that are being argued are from the pandemic. The first is that education can now be personalized and measured. So that is going to that question of what is taught. And secondly, or the second 2 areas, that teaching is about facilitation and about innovation. And those are about how teaching happens. So I'll talk about each of those in order to look at some of the assumptions and what that means for our work in fighting for public education. So in terms of the first one, personalized, they claim that technology can help adapt learning to different student needs and give learners greater ownership over what they learn, how they learn, where they learn, and when they learn. And within the document, they actually specifically focus, for example, on students with special needs, that now we'll just be able to have algorithms that can help us determine what those needs are. And the student with autism will suddenly be able to thrive in public education because technology can solve all of the issues. And what is being claimed is that technology is neutral, that technology is inclusive, and technology is the solution to educational content. And part of the analysis here is how do we start to unpack and give counterexamples of how any technology used in education is embedded in a landscape of educational equity and inequities in terms of who has access to it, the inequalities within algorithms themselves, and what gets counted as educational knowledge within these platforms. So really going back to that question of what knowledge counts. The second claim is that it's measurable. And again, thinking of PISA and the standardized testing, this is building off of that now it's not just about a test, it's about everything that happens in education can now be captured in terms of data. So we can reintegrate learning and assessment, use real-time data and feedback to help students learn better. Teachers teach better, and education systems perform more effective, again, within what their logic is of better or effective. And I know one of the workshops that's coming up will probably delve into this a bit more, but what we're seeing here is a convergence of global transformation and surveillance capitalism, where all of education becomes about gathering and selling back data. And what does that do to the control of education? Who's driving it? What is being lost in that commercialization of education through measurement? Turning then to the how, and I'm just keeping an eye on time, but please give me a minute or 2 warning if you need to. Facilitation is now seen as the role of the teacher. And they say what is clear is that for robots, classware, and predictive analytics and the like, which they say should happen, to work effectively, this will require reinventing the role of the teacher. So it's not even a question within these, and it's been building. You can see it starting in PISA, you can see it starting in OECD with Education 2030, and this is probably the most explicit I've seen it, but it's a continuation of the same thing. And it's very much built on a reductive view of teaching and learning, Freire's banking concept of education, tying to the theme of this conference. It's completely absent of relationships and how we define education more broadly, and it undermines teachers' professional judgment in being reductive to this view of facilitation. Then the final area is this idea of innovation. So moving beyond the crisis will require a more level playing field for innovation in schools. This means encouraging innovation within the system and opening it up to creative ideas from the outside. And here the language is relatively sneaky. They're trying to do this as a positive. You know, governments are not able to fully fund education, so we just need to invite companies in to be able to solve these issues and problems. But what's happening, and Sam Sellers calls this the Uberization of education that really has exploded during the pandemic, that technology companies are using the pandemic to increase the profile of their services and really market and package pieces of education that then consumers can pick and choose in order to get the kind of education that they decide they want. So overall, through all of this, it's new spaces, but it's also the continuation of colonial discourses and trends and movements within education, as that speaker said, since people came across the ocean in the boats, where what is taught in the current iteration is being captured and sold back to education systems as neutral content. So it becomes this very neat wheel of, well, of course, it's now neutral because we've created it through this measurable, neutral, equitable system. And how teaching happens becomes driven by the technological platforms, which raises the questions of who is controlling those and what is the role of teachers within it, and how is neoliberalism using that as a way to extend and adapt to changing circumstances. So what do we do? And this is where I'm going to leave it. I think, you know, the example that I gave of the teachers who came up with that workshop, I keep that in mind when I think of it, where a lot of the work that they're doing in BC classrooms is about disrupting the narrative, making it explicit. How do we not just say the OECD and these global discourses are something up here? How do we look at how it's affecting us? How do we challenge the assumptions of that? How do we say, in the context of BC, BC is not an example of the OECD's vision of Education 2030. It's a lot of amazing things, but it's not the Education 2030 that the OECD imagines. And that's through mobilizing, supporting knowledge processes. So there are, for example, amazing ways that Aboriginal knowledges, Indigenous knowledges are being infused and engaged within the classroom, but they can't then be packaged and measured within a standardized test. And so then, as in the forum today, how do we build solidarity to think back to these spaces of global governance and analyze and think about them and struggle against them together? So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully, Marie-Louise, I'm on time. And I look forward to the discussion and the questions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, André.
Thank you very much, André. I believe that you brought to the table a series of very important subject matters to touch upon. Other members from different organizations are still joining us. Welcome, you all. And now we will give the floor to Roberto Leje. He is from Brazil, PhD in education from the University of Sao Paulo. He was the Dean of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro from 2015 till 2019. And I want to add something which is of the utmost importance. He was the General Secretary of the Higher Education Union in Brazil, and he's out of the few deans who held a unionized position, and then he was appointed as a dean. This is exceptional, and we are very proud to welcome him today. At present, he is professor in the education faculty on the post-degree education program of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And of course, he is an activist. He is a union leader, a political leader who is highly committed with the struggle of our peoples. Roberto, the floor is yours and welcome. Thank you, Maria Luz. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I am going to speak Portuñol. I think it is better not to give a PowerPoint presentation. I think I will be much more brief if I just share with you characterization on my ideas. Andre just gave us a framework, a very powerful framework on the situation we live in education. In Brazil, there is an expression we've got, which is very specific on trading of education, just as Andrea mentioned. The educational field is deeply modified by the action of educational groups under the control of investment funds, who are public companies. Those groups have an influence in the creation of technological platforms and also educational systems. Now, the inclusion of the work of different professors in technological platforms broadened under the context of the pandemic. And the expansion increases the concentration of groups, of private groups and private organizations benefiting financial corporations. There is also re-performance of education itself. Let me share with you a very specific example. Cogna, which has 1 million students. It accounts for $4 billion just back in 2019. That's a value in the market, stock market. And the shares are valued in NASDAQ. NASDAQ is an educational system corporation, and it also has got technological platforms. They analyze the private education system, and they account for 19% of the basic education students, and they are part of private institutions. In higher education, they account for 77% of the students who are in this sector. But they also cover the public education network. Basic education in Brazil is under the responsibility of the municipalities, which are 5,500 in total. Therefore, trading platforms and trading teaching system leads to a very severe change in daily education of children and teenagers, both at a municipality level and at a state level. Now, technological platforms are tailored by means of algorithms. This is very, very important. And this is very significant because algorithms are preformative and they are included in elementary education as well as in higher education. Algorithms create profiles of subjects and students change in terms of their profiles. I believe that the case of Cambridge Analytics is very, very clear on how algorithms work out. In 5 years, Cogna achieved a reduction in costs, labor costs, that is, labor cost and education organizations from 56% of income to just 24% of the income. So we see a change in the expiration rate of labor. There's another corporation, Laureate, that I believe you all know in Mexico as well. Laureate uses robots. Very recently, under the pandemic context, they changed workers and they replaced them by robots. We're talking about remote education programs. Holder Cognant recently made an agreement with a telecom company creating a startup of Amplay,
so as to be able to have cheaper costs. The classes last there only 10 minutes. But what is more important here to discuss is that the curricula is defined according to the profile that is developed by the telecommunication profiling or algorithm. So for different profiles, be them grade, pre-grade, post-grade, postgraduate studies, there are different profiles. And so these corporations are currently training most of elementary teachers in Brazil. The private sector nowadays with remote learning practices covers 75% of all of the investment funds devoted for this purpose, and there are 633,000 teachers who are currently being trained. So as you can imagine, this is a change within the structure, because this is most of the future teachers have been trained according to corporation standards. This is only possible in the context of a cultural war that is waged within the Bolsonaro administration. Bolsonaro has a very dangerous combination of cultural wars and extreme neoliberalism. There is a parliamentary committee for investigative purposes, and they have determined that Bolsonaro committed a crime against humanity by his actions. More than 600,000 people died during the pandemic because of his negligence. Speaking about students, there are 70 million students all throughout Brazil of all levels. Around 50% of them have no access to internet connection infrastructures or don't have the material resources so as to keep on studying in a remote way. So the higher education system has changed its admission rules. There is usually an entrance exam that is held for all higher education positions, but from 5.7 million students that used to be admitted, it's only now 3 million of them, especially the ones that have been segregated is the indigenous groups, the African descendants, people who are far away from having the possibility of taking this exam. So there is a very well-planned structural segregation intention behind this. During the times of the pandemic, 2.2 million teachers of the school system, around 50% of them have no contract. They don't have a full-time contract. They have not signed them. And many of them did not even, the ones that did have a contract beforehand, they were not renewed. So this is a very serious situation that is changing the labor conditions. There is an extreme burnout within the teachers community. People are feeling lots of despair, tiredness, lack of acknowledgement, and they feel attacked, and all of the burnouts symptoms that come along with this. So the government is waging a very strong attack against teachers with neo-fascist trends. They say that universities are only meant for the elite. The Ministry of Finance of the country is saying that nowadays, even the son of a janitor wants to go to college. How dare they? And the president is speaking about racial quotas as if it was a movement in which the dumb system, the less intelligent students are bringing on the quality of the educational system because of their inferior nature. So this is something that is said by Bolsonaro over and over again. Science is thought to be just a fiction of cultural Marxism. So this is a very ferocious environment we're living in, unfortunately. So to wrap it up, I think it is very important for us to go back to an idea that Paulo Freire taught us. The extreme right, through their think tanks and Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and through different strategies of how the algorithms are designed to perform in a certain way, everything has caused a certain mental attitude, mental disposition towards certain ideas that are highly reactive, and they're happening. They're very patriarchal, homophobic, elitist, sexist, and all sorts of discriminations included in this type of reactionary activities that are taking place. So the minds of the people are being shaped. Common sense is nothing but common here. That is the main problem with education nowadays in Brazil, as well as with politics. Freire talked about how what he called the intransitive awareness, the consciousness, a naive awareness that can be transformed when you have a dialogue with people, when you speak through circles of culture where there's a deep reflection about the meaning of words, so that an awareness can be created through critical thinking. We need to go back to that. We need to challenge the widely accepted common sense that it's not making sense at all. In 2019, Brazil, the youth developed a tsunami of education, if you may, with more than 1 million people out in the streets demonstrating. There are very important strikes to defend life. There is a struggle to change the middle high education, or to face the changes that are being proposed in the Constitution. There is a bill of law, very dangerous, that is taking place in my country right now, that is causing great trouble. So the biggest challenge is, how do we construct a different type of understanding? Floresta Fernandez, a sociologist in Brazil, spoke about the need of a new departing point. We need a redimensioning of all of our social public education fights, because it is no longer possible for us to defend public education with teachers, students alone. It is important for us to strike new alliances, especially at an international level. Idea Network REDCEPA is a true inspiration and a historical need for all the fights of teachers in defense of public education all throughout the continent. Thank you. Roberto, thank you so much. Andre, thank you as well. I think that both of you have set the background for the discussion, for the ideas, for the proposals. Thank you for that. We are speaking about educational policies in the times of the pandemic, regional trends, and the dispute for public education. So both Andre as well as Roberto have brought us back to the idea of, or the question rather, of how do we dispute the current mainstream discourse to defend public education from the grassroots, from our peoples. And I believe that this is something that's paramount. We have a few minutes for us to perhaps have a small Q&A. We have only 15 minutes. So I'd like to ask everyone, be very brief with your comments or questions. For the people who are broadcasting the signal in Facebook and YouTube, could you please let me know if there are questions? Bring them to the Zoom chat so that we can answer them. And so we are ready for your questions. Be very succinct. Once again, we request of everyone to be very succinct, very brief in your questions or comments, so that we can give some final 3 minutes to each one of our presenters and so that they can wrap it up. Who would like to ask or comment? Mr. Raciel from Section 18, Michoacán, the Cente Union in Mexico. Please go ahead. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Brothers and sisters. Undoubtedly, this is a matter that is very relevant for all educational workers, and we are all very much preoccupied and occupied by it. It is fundamental for us to analyze how to defend the right to public education, because we could do different exercises to exchange ideas, but what do we do in the practice? Because in our different states and countries, we are all trying to put up a fight to be the resistance to stop this globalization policy and to stop the trend to privatize public systems, public education systems. The efforts that we have made so far vis-a-vis this neoliberal attack at the global level, the humble or big efforts that we've made require a broader perspective, a broader project in which we could align our efforts and work all together so as to come up with a continental resistance, a continental fight. So my question for our speakers is, could you give us an idea, a proposal of how to work together so that we, from the north to the south, all throughout the Americas, can work together towards the same goal and defend and protect public education? Thank you. And thank you for being so succinct. Anyone else? Are there any other questions for our speakers? No. All right. No comments on Facebook then? No comments on YouTube so far? No, we're good. All right. So please, we are now going to ask, if you agree, to give Andre and Roberto a chance to answer Jose Raciel's question. Why don't we follow the same order? Andre first, and then Roberto, 3 minutes as well. Very briefly, 4 tops, so that we can conclude this on time. So Andre, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think, to me, that is the work of international solidarity, regional solidarity, right? That what always strikes me in these conversations is the global discourse tries to brush over and erase the specificity of education. So it tries to create a picture where it can be globalized. And a lot of times coming together means sharing the differences, sharing the realities, and then looking at the ways that those speak back to the common sense that's being told to us. So, you know, I think whenever I hear teachers from other countries speak about, I'm actually looking at the list that, you know, the teachers that worked on the workshop for us were talking about in BC, the way all of this is playing out in the classroom and burnout, colonial ways of thinking, isolation, loss of autonomy. And it's almost mobilizing those stories and those experiences and not letting them become a new global, but rather to think about how do we engage those in order to make the global not make sense anymore. So that's one of the main interests that I'm looking at and thinking about. I'll turn it to Roberto to.
Adelante, Roberto.
Ok. Es muy buena la reflexión de Raciel.
Professor Raciel's reflection is very good. I believe that something that is core right now is to speak of a continental movement to ban the intervention of the open capital's actions with everything, those companies that are trading in the stock exchange market, that they shouldn't be involved in public education of our countries. China not long ago developed a new type of regulation that is very strict to prevent private corporations, the private platforms, the private teaching systems to behave, to influence, to tamper with elementary education in China. And this goes from elementary to all the way up to higher education, and that should be our priority. We need to take them out of our public education systems. The second thing, and following Raciel's reflection, the coalition of unions, students' movements, and the rest of associations of universities in the South with the Montevideo group, all of us, we have been working to oppose the free trade agreements. We created a very robust network all throughout the region, including the indigenous peoples, to defend the water, to defend the biodiversity, to defend the rights of the peoples, the right to a public education, against the commoditization of a public education. So I believe that the advance of the alt-right, the right-wing parties are forcing us to develop a new resistance, but perhaps we need a different type of configuration. The methodology of the oppressed and the resistance is something that we have learned, and we have each attempted different strategies. We need to work all together to align those efforts. Thank you. Thank you, Roberto. So, Marilu says, it seems to me that we have a very big challenge ahead of us, no doubt about it. So once again, this question of Dr. Raciel's is paramount. In my own personal opinion, and because of my experience as a teacher, as an activist in our fight, I believe that the path forward has to be, as it's been said here, first to acknowledge the diversity of the efforts of the things that we have done already, while constructing our network to work together, our different networks. And I said this in the beginning, we have presence of Red Estrado, we have the presence of different union leaders who are part of the International Educación América Latina, another type of us working together. We are here, the International Coalition in the Defense of Public Education, Mexico, Canada, and the States. We are part of the Social Network for Public Research for Public Education in the America, for the defense of public education. But there are other efforts that are being made as well. and I don't know how they call it, the continental coordinator of teachers' fights or something like that. Raciel is working with that project in Section 18 of our union. CENTES efforts in Mexico are quite notable. That's the first thing. We need to acknowledge that we are very diverse group of people. We need to value the things that have happened in the past, because it's not that we are reinventing the wheel or starting from scratch. We have inherited historical fights that need to be acknowledged, and we need to learn from them. And then another thing that we need is that it is important for us to go deeper in our understanding of our current processes, because it is not the same thing as we say colloquially here in Mexico now that 20 years afterwards. That is to say, maybe privatization has been here for 20 years, but its face has changed. It is not the same strategists, it is not the same people. So I believe that in terms of collective action, we have gone from the idea of union fronts as what was paramount to the construction of a more social approach of the experiences with our joint efforts between unions, social movements, communities. I believe that there are many examples. If we think about Chicago or the Cente, this is something very rich. Therefore, in this forum, we need to reflect upon this, because there's been something very special about Idea Network, and that is to have all ideas bring together. We invite everyone, we ask everyone. We are always trying to have a very big umbrella that can protect everybody, but at the same time that is helping us go with the flow with all of the richness that we can gather all together. And I think that's very important. All right. Sorry. Cecilia, you only have 3 minutes. Hi, just to go back to what the first speaker had mentioned, I believe that the conflict beyond privatization of education, it lies on what we're teaching and how we're teaching. So it is important for us to think about the pedagogy and going back to Paulo Freire, the idea of praxis. And this is something that has to be highlighted today and tomorrow. The big problem now is not so much about what we are forced to teach, but how we are legitimizing, we're normalizing those things. So it is up for us to rethink, so that later we can create a greater resistance. Thank you. Very important. Thank you. Thank you for raising the hand. Mr. Franklin, we need to go, so please be very brief. Thank you. From Ecuador, I send you the best. 3 very quick things. One, just because the states are teaching a bad education and now it's been privatized and the cost is so high at all levels, well, very few people benefit from this, and this is how education is becoming legitimized. Now, secondly, I would like for us to have teachers who are out in the land influencing education. We want those people who are living according to the principles of Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of the question. How do we advocate internationally at a worldwide level in those different spaces, so that this reaches all the corners of the land? And finally, we as people, because I'm not a teacher, I work in a cooperative financing institution, but we are involved in education, and we need to have financial education rather, for everyone, so that people know how to use their resources and invest within their communities. This is something I would like to be included. And from Ecuador, I send you my regards. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So it is time for us to finish this part. Andre, Roberto, are we good? Or is there anything else you'd like to say? Yes, just very quickly. In Brazil, the corporations are looking at the public funds. There's no commoditization without public funds. And that is a perspective towards the government, the state, and it requires the reconfiguration of the states here in Latin America as well. Thank you, Roberto. Andre, anything else?
I think just adding with the thought that teachers' professional judgment autonomy is at the heart of this conversation, right? And so much of the global is about experts telling teachers what to do. And my interest is how can teachers be recognized and supported and mobilized as experts on their own practice? And how do we learn from that? So I look forward to the conversations in the rest of the day and tomorrow.
Muy bien. Pues muchas gracias a todos y todas.
Everyone, thank you. And this has been a very good beginning, a good kickoff. And we are now going to go to the different workshops. So Maria, could you please help us what's coming up next so that we go to where we need to go?
Muchas gracias. Como les comentamos al inicio, tenemos 3 paneles y en estos paneles voy a compartir.
There are going to be 3 workshops. I'm going to share my screen very quickly so that you can choose where to go.
I'm going to let you know how this will work so you can pick your panels. We've got 3 panels. Teaching struggles and student struggles in times of pandemic experiences. And this will be analyzed in the small breakout rooms. We will open the breakout rooms after this explanation. And if you decide, you can go to your groups. Both speakers and those who join these breakout rooms pick panel 1, teachers and student struggles in time of pandemic. Second panel, labor conditions in the virtual context and going back to schools. This will be right here where we are. This is where this will be developed. In the case of panel 2, we will have Mr. Pereira from Argentina, Jackson Potter from the United States, and Gary Fenn from Canada. This is going to be a bilingual panel, so we'll stay here. Panel 1 will welcome Marvin Antonio Lopez, a student, Executive Secretary of Oecd. Then we'll also have Mr. William Velandia from Colombia, and Professor Isabel Vargas, Chair of the National Union of Educators. And I repeat, this panel will be for a small group in Spanish. Finally, panel 3, Pandemic, Technology, and Right to Education. We will leave this room. We'll go to a breakout room, and over there we will also have simultaneous interpretation. Our moderator will be Paul Bucking from Canada, from the University of Toronto, QP Canada. We will listen to Larry Keane from the BCTF, Canada, Professor Dalila Andrade Oliveira from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. So if you decide to join this panel, we share the link here, and there will be simultaneous interpretation as well. Work in these rooms will take place during an hour. And then we'll come back together for conclusions of the workshops. We will meet right here with the link that you received when you enrolled. We will share final conclusions of the day all together. This has to do with instructions to join different breakout rooms. Franklin, I don't know if you have a question or a comment or something like that, but your hand is raised. Oh, no, just the hand was raised, but it's okay. All right, well then, I want to thank you, and I will start opening the rooms, the breakout rooms. Veronica has already shared the link for panel 3. So, just a second. And this is for people who are in panel 1. You may go now. I'd like to ask the speakers to join panel 1. Maria, I just have a question. We've got a curtain while we move to the different panels. Shall I stay here or shall I go to a specific panel to continue with this broadcasting? Stay here, please. Thank you. I shall stay here then. Thank you. Here we've got Marvin. One second, please. In case of Marvin and Isabel, I will send you to group 1. I don't know if you already had the chance to join. I've already assigned them, but they have not accepted the invitation to join. All right. So Isabel, please. Professor Maria Trejos is asking about panel 2. Panel 2 will stay here.
El panel 2 se queda aquí. Buenas tardes.
Panel 2 stays here. That is correct. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Fidel Garcia will be the moderator. He is the chair of Honduras Middle Education College. We've got here Eduardo, Jackson, and Gary, and the moderators. So the moderator will be here, and I leave you now so you can start. Good afternoon.
Hola.
Hello.
Hola.
Hello.
Hola, sí te escuchamos.
Yes, we can hear you, Professor.
¿Comenzamos, María?
Shall we begin, Maria? Shall I start? Are we ready?
Cuando me indiquen, abro los micrófonos ya en la transmisión.
As soon as you let me know, I will open the microphones for the broadcasting.
Profesor Fidel, me parece que los ponentes para este panel están...
Professor Fidel, it seems that the speakers for this panel are ready, so if you please, we may start. I'm just waiting for you to give me the instruction. Thank you, Veronica. Then I believe we are ready. All right. Welcome you all, and greetings from the middle education college from Honduras, celebrating the 100th year anniversary of one of the greatest philosophers and professors of history. We are very proud because he was born in our continent. He was Latin American, Paulo Freire. We are very glad to celebrate together. We are in the midst of this pandemic, and we are trying to guide and help each other on how to becoming resilient in face of all this situation. The question placed by our friend from Mexico in the previous panel is precisely a question that we should try to continue answering: how to achieve articulation of the whole teaching sector, not only in Latin America, but in the whole continent, to defend the right of the peoples to continue having and receiving public education, and to stop the neoliberal context. This is the context where we are. Paulo Freire illustrates on what the behavior should be, what our guidance should be in this teaching activity that we hold, in trying to guide and form the society. Today, we are a part of panel 2. I want to welcome you all. I want to welcome the speakers. This is known as labor conditions in the context of virtuality and going back to school. I am Fidel Garcia, chair of the Middle Education College in Honduras. We want to tell the speakers and all the participants that there will be a certificate. You must attend 80% of the sessions. There will be a roster within the chat. So if you may not download the roster, you can enter your information within the chat and the place where you are connecting from, and then my peers will register your attendance. If you want to receive a certificate, an attendance certificate to this forum, we want to remind you that there's simultaneous translation in English and Spanish. And you may just go to the world icon underneath your screen and pick the language of your preference. Should you have any difficulty, please write it down within your chat and the technical team will help you solve. The panel has been scheduled for an hour and it'll work in the following way. Every speaker, we've got 3 speakers: Mr. Eduardo Pereira from Argentina, Mr. Jackson Potter from the United States of America, and we've got Gary Fenn from Canada. They will be our speakers, and they will be assigned a maximum time of 10 minutes for a presentation. There will be a Q&A session on behalf of the attendees, and you may write down your questions within the chat. Or if you will interact with us through Facebook, you may post your questions in Facebook. Afterwards, the speakers will entertain those questions. They will have 2 minutes to entertain the questions. Questions should be very, very specific. If the question is specific for one of the speakers, you have to clarify that, please, within the chat, and they will have 2 minutes to reply. Now, the moderator, who's me in this case, will read the questions posted in the Zoom chat, and we will allocate 10 minutes for that. Then we will have a round of replies and conclusions, 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll close the panel and we'll go back to the plenary session. Speakers, as we have already said before, Mr. Pereira from Argentina, International Affairs from the Federal Education Confederation of the Republic of Argentina. He wrote The Legacy of Paulo Freire in Public Education and Teaching Work, published by Cetera recently. Jackson Potter from the United States of America, member of the Union of Professors of Chicago, CTU for its acronym in English, or Chicago Teachers Union, and Gary Fern from Canada, Executive Assistant in the Federation of Teachers of Junior High Schools, Ontario, with main offices in Ontario, Canada. He used to be District Officer in OSSTF. So, we are ready. We are ready. We've got this amazing topic, conditions, labor conditions in this pandemic environment. We have three amazing speakers, and with no further ado, let us enjoy them. So now we give the floor to Eduardo Pereira. He's going to be our first speaker, Eduardo Pereira. The floor is yours. Welcome. Welcome all the way from the Republic of Argentina. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon for us here in Argentina. Fidel, thank you very much for this introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with all of you and with Gary and Jackson, who are going to give presentations, but I also want to congratulate Roberto because he's just been appointed in a new position. We enjoyed your presentation. We also shared the struggle of the Brazilian peoples to not have that president. We want Bolsonaro out of Brazil. Hopefully, Lula da Silva will be the next president. We desire that and we dream of that too. Steve, of course, who's here, who has always been here leading this network. And as the previous panel mentioned, this is part of the struggle to defend public education, public schools. And this struggle is permanent amongst teachers and students. We join forces because on the other side, there's a coalition of forces that want for the public school to play a different role from the one we conceive. So now I want to ask Fidel not to have any problem to let me know when my time is up, because I get excited with my subjects and I don't want to take more time than the one I've been allocated. To begin with, well, this subject matter was very important for us and it continues to be very important. Here in Argentina, we are already back to school in the whole country. 100% of teachers who decided to get vaccinated are vaccinated already. They've already received both dosages. This was a struggle from the teachers' union, taken and adopted by the government as a priority. Teachers had priority to get vaccinated. And we can say that when we discuss the labor subject matter and we include it as the teaching subject matter, we are not just talking about a working category and that it is just including labor relationships of the teachers and professors, but that category related to a workload, to a workplace, is directly related to the possibility of learning from our students. There may not be teaching without learning. Furthermore, for us, the best way of facing the struggle against sectors who are not teachers or students in this broad coalition is tough. We see this as one thing only, teachers together with students. That's the best way. We are looking for the best way to learn and teach, both together, teachers and students. Overnight, 1.5 billion students and 64 million professors had to leave our daily place, which was the public school, and go to virtual education, something that has never been seen before in the history of education here. This has never happened before. It's unprecedented, and therefore it required unprecedented responses too. What we saw at the beginning from the unionized front was that there was full support from society, including the dominant economic sectors. So it was necessary to move to virtual education. I share this with you because that lasted only 2 months, especially in concentrated sectors of economy. And during the third month, they started to demand the government for children to go back to the schoolrooms. They talked about the mask, all the sanitation measures, but they had to go back, especially when the highest peak of pandemic was present there. So what did we see between and amongst our periods? Well, many different things, but I want to focus on two aspects mainly. On the one hand, they were anxious to prove that thousands and thousands of our students did not have access to technological tools for teachers to teach them on a virtual basis. So we're talking about students that had no computers, many families who did not have a cell phone, or maybe in the family they just had one cell phone that the father or the mother required to work, or any of the other siblings who also studied. That was the best case scenario. But then there was a problem because virtual education was not for all, just for a few. The most favored sectors of society had other devices, including computers, laptops, cell phones, as it happens in every single society of Latin America, at least. So here we see the first problem. And the second problem is the labor burden. So work schedules were diluted, faded. There was not the time in which we moved from school and then we left and went home. No, throughout the day, parents were asking questions, mothers, fathers, WhatsApp exchange between students and professors all day long. So the working schedule was expanded to the whole day. This generated stress. First of all, not all children could have access to electronic devices to receive virtual education. And then the working burden, which lasted all day long. So as the union organization, we talked to the government and we said we need to talk about a discussion between teachers. This is like a social dialogue. We needed to come to an agreement between the government and the unions, teaching unions, to establish a new labor regime. And we came to an agreement. During the third month, we had this agreement. In Argentina, agreements between the government and the unions are based on the law, so they are mandatory. We need to abide by them. Now, very briefly, what did that agreement include? First off, to acknowledge the teaching work during the pandemic, the virtual work. We've never had this before. It was non-existent before. The only sector in Argentina in which there was virtual education, partial virtual education in some cases, was in the higher education in universities, but the rest of the education system was always face-to-face education. Now, second, we guaranteed all the payments. We worked with the same payment as before, and there was a possibility of having licenses. We acknowledged any disease of professors or teachers, and then that professor or teacher was replaced by another professor. Then respect the working time, what we call the right to disconnection. The professor could disconnect as soon as they finished their work, their working schedule. This was of extreme importance. This was very welcome by our professors and teachers. And it was a great achievement because they could come out from this very initial stressful situation, acknowledging the work accident insurance coverage. We acknowledged accidents at home as part of working accidents, as if they were at school. And then we also accepted union rights. The company accepted all of these. They could execute their own leave of absence to go to union meetings. And we held training actions That is, if there were teachers' meetings that day, classes were not given, and they worked together. And there were other agreements, but it would be too long if I explained to you everything. That was the first agreement. And so labor stress decreased. Secondly, we agreed printing 6,000 teaching booklets made by the education workers to share with students that had no connection. Therefore, we ensured almost 100% of our students in the country receiving education. In some cases, virtual education, and in other cases, by means of these booklets that we distributed. The third element is that we used 30,000 new positions amongst the students. So they were visited. If they had no devices, the professors visited and taught them there. The fourth element is we built an observatory on policies related to the pandemic. What for? To be able to discuss with every government, the national and the province governments, based on the number of cases. We're talking about COVID cases in each place, in the district, in the city, in the town. If we started releasing permits to go to school and have face-to-face education. We discussed this together with union. Up to that moment, many governments wanted to solve this, to decide when we would have face-to-face education. So under the observatory, we came to this agreement. We assigned different researchers to define this. And then another problem came up, the one I mentioned a while ago. Entrepreneurial sectors were pressing. They wanted to go back to school, to face-to-face education, because they needed parents to be working in their company. So here we see something which is called as a window of opportunity to discuss what we were discussing in the first panel, in which Andre and Roberto mentioned so wisely. On the one hand, the trading sectors that talk about the great virtues of virtual education above face-to-face education. And then Bill Gates was giving advice to the state of New York, so there was no face-to-face education. So our partner from the United States should tell us if that's an extraordinary expenditure from the state when you can receive virtual education. On the one hand, that was a great debate to decide if they were going back to school or not. And they defended virtual education. On the other hand, entrepreneurs saying, go back to school, go back to face-to-face education, because we need parents in our factories to ensure the capitalistic system. So there's a great window of opportunity there. And we are working very hard on this. Eduardo, you have to close now. All right, so let me close. Great debate is now open. It started during the pandemic, and although the pandemic is not over, face-to-face education is back, and the productive sector is there. And we have to decide what school we want, what type of education we want. This is the best time. We want to go back to school to pre-pandemic. Is that the school that we dreamt of for our countries? Do we have to decide that? In Argentina, we believe that we have to make the best out of this opportunity, because the pandemic modified our reality, and it was modified for not really for good. Rich people are richer, wealthy people are wealthier, and poor people are poorer. But now we can discuss a new type of education, an education that will at least help discuss these situations on inequality. And I'm going to stop, and then I shall entertain some questions. Thank you very much, Eduardo. We understand that 10 minutes is not much for this subject matter. But we see now how we identify with each other. In Latin America, we have many similar aspects. In Argentina, you have a few aspects that we don't have in the rest of the country, such as vaccination. In Honduras, the professors were never priority. The right to disconnection, we still don't have it. And you have great progress in acknowledging labor accidents at home and the booklets to teach. Maybe that's not what's happening in the rest of the countries, but we see how labor conditions may vary from one country to the other, but there will always be something that's a common denominator, which is threats in labor conditions. Thank you very much, Eduardo. From Argentina. You may start writing your questions through the chat. If you are in Facebook, you can write your questions there as well. Now, let us listen to Mr. Jackson Potter, our partner from the United States of America. So, Jackson, if you are ready, the floor is yours. Go ahead, Jackson.
Thank you, Fidel. Gracias, Fidel. I'm going to talk about the United States context in general for teachers in public schools and Chicago more specifically. When COVID broke out, it was about March 20th, 2020, when schools closed down in Chicago and went fully remote. And the mayor was reluctant initially and adopted President Trump's position that teachers were essential workers. Even though we knew very little about the disease, the position both at the national level and the local level of political leaders was that the economy was more important than human life. But we resisted. We were able to get the schools to close initially. We stayed remote for the next period through the fall. But starting in January of 2021, the schools and the mayor started to bring students and teachers back in a hybrid model that was partially in person, partially remote, except for preschool teachers were kind of forced back in person. And then it went to kindergarten through eighth grade and finally high school. This method and strategy of management, it reduced our solidarity. Sorry, I'm at the school right now, so we have an announcement. This diminished our solidarity because they were able to break apart people in different groups. But it also led to some amazing resistance. And so once the pre-kindergarten teachers were brought back, a number of us refused to go back in person, refused to report unless it was on the computer remotely, because there weren't proper mitigation methods or guarantees in place. So there was a lot of concern that more students would get sick. Many of my students were in a low-income, primarily Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. Many of their family members were sick. Many died. So this was a real issue, that this was going to spread COVID in the schools. So when our pre-kindergarten members refused to go back, they were threatened with discipline, threatened with being fired, and we came together to support them and each other, demanding less online class time, more staff, vaccine access for both teachers and students, testing for COVID, a metric to determine when we would need to close schools if there was an outbreak, contact tracing, masks, and hand sanitizer, like other guests have talked about, and elimination of any discipline that teachers received for refusing to work in unsafe conditions. And eventually we won many of those things in an agreement, a return to work agreement. There have been challenges, lack of computers, many undocumented families, Mexican families, Latin American families, immigrant families, did not receive any financial assistance from the government during this period, even though many people were laid off from their jobs. We had homeless students that did not receive extra additional services or support during this period. And many students faced mental health issues. So we conducted, in the spirit of Freire, we conducted outreach to parents and community stakeholders in order for us to define collectively what a remote, hybrid, and in-person conditions would be acceptable. And our vision for public schools during this period and after COVID, not going back to normal. That was unacceptable. We also did a lot of mutual aid, making sure families were fed, had cash assistance. Teachers raised a lot of money and support for families that weren't receiving it. And really at the heart of the debate in the United States was an argument about survival. Do people get basic rights during a pandemic, or do we have to go to work and risk our lives? Those were the questions. And the pandemic forced us, our members and the society more largely, to really embrace anti-capitalist and anti-racist values. The Black Lives Matter movement in protest against George Floyd's murder occurred during this period, and it was the largest protest movement in U.S. history. We learned the importance of mental health, broad coalitions, educations that we control, not the tech industry, is what actually people prefer. And ironically, it's what capitalism prefers. The capitalists realize that they need us in classrooms, in person, and that we have leverage to shape and use our power to determine what that looks like, more so than ever, I think, because of this realization. In Los Angeles, for example, they were able to win a new model of schools called Sustainable Community Schools, 50 schools that are created with parents, with students, with community groups, and have different pedagogy that really emphasizes liberation over adhering to the rules or getting a job for the state or for the system. So here are some opportunities and threats, and I will finish my comments. I think we have reduced the reliance on standardized tests because of this new thinking. More university systems are rejecting standardized tests. A threat is that there are more racial and economic disparities in the United States and in the world. And that will be exacerbated when assistance from the government begins to decline. In Illinois, for example, in Chicago, 60,000 people are in danger of being evicted from their homes because they can't pay rent. 200,000 people are in danger of losing their homes because they cannot pay their mortgage. An opportunity, we are more aware of the importance of socialization in pedagogy and direct experience. A threat, Andre talked about this. There's more surveillance technology governing our teaching and learning. I think another threat is we lack international coordination and solidarity, not because of Red Cepa. I blame more the rich countries, the United States, the Chicago Teachers Union. We could do more. Rich countries need to do more. The forces for public education to demand equity in resources, equity in vaccines, like what Fidel was saying about Honduras. We should not be getting boosters when teachers in Honduras cannot get their initial vaccine. An opportunity, we have increased awareness of economic and racial disparities and inequality, and new possibilities to grow local and national political transformation. And then last, the United States is a threat to the world. It still is. The far right continues to have a lot of power. And I do not think it's unlikely, unfortunately, that a Trump or someone like him would win re-election in the next cycle. And that threatens the ability of the planet to survive, not just political possibilities in the United States. So thank you for this opportunity and hope to talk more.
Bueno, gracias Jackson por la puntualidad y ser el buen manejo del...
Thank you, Jackson, for being so punctual and for managing time so well. We are monitoring now questions. We will listen to Gary Pham from Canada. Gary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I just want to check everyone can hear me okay. I see some nods. Yes. Perfecto. Thanks, and thank you very much. And it's good to see some familiar faces again, albeit virtually, and I hope that we have the opportunity to get together in person sometime soon. I'm going to talk to you today from the perspective of Canada, but focus more on the province of Ontario. Education is the jurisdiction of the provinces in Canada, so mine will be a bit more of an Ontario case, but in listening to my colleagues across Canada, we share, of course, many of the same struggles and issues around virtual learning and returning to school in a safe way, and the conditions we faced over the last 18 months. Just by summary quickly, in Ontario and across Canada for that matter, schools closed mid-March in 2020 and stayed closed till the end of the school year, and everyone switched to virtual. I think Eduardo put it in perspective when he said how many people, both educators and students, all at once went from in buildings to virtual learning, and that had never been done before. And our teachers, our education workers, and our students and families had to do that with little to no preparation, and as a result, with little to no support from the provincial government and from local school boards. Granted, they were caught a little off guard, but it took months before there was action and funding put into place to support those students and their educators to make for some kind of positive learning experience. But our members in our union, our teachers, our education workers, of course, do their best under difficult circumstances. And so we stayed virtual until the end of that school year. Schools reopened in September 2020 with new conditions put in place for safety. But of course, the government had done very little to prepare. We called for a number of things. We called for better ventilation. Nothing happened. The government said that they would bring in filters for all the classrooms. That never happened. They did require masking for all students and for staff. That did happen. But they also said, we'll do rapid testing of students and staff. But that didn't happen. So what happened, of course, were that in Ontario, many schools closed right after the Christmas holidays. And some started to reopen depending on what region of the province they were in through into February. And then the numbers spiked again, the third wave. And all schools in Ontario closed in April and stayed closed until June. And we all switched to virtual again, many of us for the third time in a year and a half. Now, across Canada, other provinces kept their schools open with some small exceptions. I know in British Columbia, one school district outside of Vancouver did close for a little while and go fully virtual. But we were the difference in the country. Ontario had schools closed and students in virtual learning the most across the province because our cases were the worst. And that's because of poor government action and poor government funding to try to stem the growth of the virus across the province. But schools are open now, and we're staying open. And we've had the challenge of, are the conditions safe? In Ontario, there is a law where you can issue a work refusal. You can make a work refusal if you find your working conditions are unsafe. And it requires a Ministry of Labor inspector to come in and check things out. However, we had very few Ministry of Labor orders written, very few violations cited. We have launched some grievances, but very few have been successful, and still a bunch of those grievances are still in process. It takes a long time to get a grievance through the system. But at the start of the school year, we had 5 very simple calls. Vaccinations was the first. We do support mandatory vaccination of staff and subsequently of students. Right now in Ontario, children between the ages of 12 and 17 can be vaccinated. We have just heard that a drug from Pfizer has been approved, is about to be approved for 5 to 11-year-olds. And we support that, as do all of the education unions in Ontario. Most of our members are vaccinated, although, much like the rest of society, there's a few that are not. Teachers were supposed to be a priority. And we've heard in some countries where teachers were a priority. Our government announced that teachers would be a higher priority than other groups. But when it was announced that teachers could go get vaccinations, there were no vaccinations available. It took about 5 to 6 more months before teachers would have access to vaccinations, which really it ended up being by the beginning of the school year. Before we could see a more saturation of teachers get vaccinated. However, most are. Ventilation we called for. I mentioned that earlier. Most schools do have high quality ventilation units in classrooms, but not all. The government promised this a full year ago and said they were coming. And it took them over a year to get them, and they're still not completely deployed. We call for masking. That has happened. Students are required to wear masks in the school, as are educators. Testing. A lot of talk, no action. And the government announced a few pilot programs for rapid testing in schools, which many experts say is a good way to stop the spread of COVID. But very few random tests rapid tests are available out in our schools. They only seem to show up where we see outbreaks. The last thing we've called for is distancing, the ability for students to physically distance from each other. That means smaller class sizes. In no way are there smaller class sizes. In fact, we've seen some bigger class sizes where we see 30, 35 students crammed into elementary schools and in high schools together in small spaces. And the government and health units, local health units, have called for what we call cohorting. I don't know if you can translate that, Steve. Cohorting, which means you keep students in groups together so they don't mix with other groups of students. Well, that doesn't really exist because students are allowed to interact with anyone before school, on their buses, at lunch, after school. So there is no cohorting, even though they say there is. So have we got all these things? Well, as you heard, no, not really. But also, what we have seen, and Jackson alluded to this, about solidarity and trust. Teachers and education workers have become more popular, if I could say that, and more trusted than they were before. And strangely enough, teachers' unions have garnered a higher level of trust due to the campaigning we have done calling for these greater safety measures. In fact, trust levels are far higher than they are of the government. And this is interesting because we had just completed a round of bargaining, a very difficult round of bargaining that involved rotating strikes just before COVID started. And we settled just as the pandemic started up. And we were able to get public support when the government was trying to negotiate significant cuts to education and sharp increases to class sizes. Now, seeing my time is nearly done, I'm going to mention one particular thing about virtual learning that's been a problem in some of our school boards. The Ontario government has left it completely up to local school boards, and there are over 70 local school boards in the province of Ontario. Those school boards have been left to decide how they'll deal with remote learning, because the government said you must offer a remote learning choice for students this coming school year. Some have set up virtual schools. What we're saying are temporary virtual schools for those students and parents who are concerned about getting COVID at schools. But some have also decided not to set up a virtual school and instead do what we call hybrid learning. And that term may be familiar to some of you. Hybrid learning in our context means you have one class, but some are learning in an actual physical classroom with the teacher, but that same teacher is also teaching students watching online, live streamed into that same classroom. We call it distracted learning. because the teacher has to go back and forth between the computer screen and the students in person and try to deliver the lesson to both simultaneously. It's burning a number of our teachers out. Many of our boards don't do this, but it seems that the urban boards, like Toronto.
That's it, Gary.
Couple minutes.
Gracias, Gary.
Thank you, Gary.
Oh, he's frozen.
We found it very interesting that Canada is facing problems that are very similar to Honduras in the area of education. But we want to allow time for a round of questions and comments. And he has frozen. And so we're opening to a space for questions or commentaries towards the presenters. If anyone would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand, your virtual hand. Hello.
Buenas tardes, ¿puedo hablar?
May I speak? Go ahead, compañera Cisa Pacari. Yes, thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Steve, and all the organizers, the Idea Network organizers and the teachers who are organizing and participating in this forum. I just want to reflect a little on the question of the reality of teachers in the role of unions. In the unions in other countries, like we've heard in Chile and Argentina, there's a strengthening of the teachers' unions, not just in the rural areas, but in the rural areas. I'm talking about where there's large indigenous populations. They're really pushing distance education and platform education. And to me, it seems like the platforms seem like a danger to isolate teachers and to give them heavy days and administrative tasks that doesn't give them time to meet with the other teachers and to support the work of the unions. For example, here in the rural areas in Ecuador, the intercultural bilingual educators, I feel like they've been left behind by the unions because they don't have the space to meet with their colleagues and learn about the work that the union's doing. So I think given the fact that we interact, the teachers tend to interact through groups of WhatsApp, but that's not enough to carry out an effective struggle in defense of education. And so we haven't been able to carry forward the law for intercultural education and the reforms are supposed to reduce the amount of the workday to 6 hours of attending to students, but this has not been carried out in the countryside. And so my question is, how, as unions, are we working to integrate rural and indigenous intercultural educators who often are left out in the movement to kind of virtual education? Cisa, is that for any of the panelists? Yes, any of the panelists that wish to, because they have different experiences in their countries. So how do we strengthen the teachers union? From the maybe Eduardo could open with a response with that.
Bueno, es una muy buena y difícil.
Excuse me, Eduardo. I think you are ahead of a lot of Latin America in terms of the advances that Cetera has made. So maybe when you're talking about this, you could also talk about how you made this. So how do we strengthen the unions and the support among rural teachers for the unions? It's a very complicated question to answer because it's got different angles. And I want to first say to not brag about all the victories or advances that we've gotten, is that we were lucky to have in power at the time of the pandemic a government that is one that's willing to listen, a government that is open to the social movements and will respond to them, which is very different than we had a couple of years before. If we hadn't elected a progressive government prior to the pandemic, we would have been facing the same situation that they're facing under Bolsonaro in Brazil. And so it's a struggle, as Paulo Freire said in his honor, is that the political struggle is part of the defense of education. I need to say that we in the 11th of September, the same year that we carried out an action against the coup in Chile, that the line at the time was that the unions should be pure and not be involved in politics, but we've been very clear about the need to have political action and to be involved in the pedagogy, and to not just deal with labor demands, because that cuts us off from the population, and it opens up space for the right to occupy that space. If we only argued about salaries for ourselves, and we would have every right to do that, because that's the legitimate role of unions. But when we go in front of the unemployed workers or workers with low salaries, we need to be able to dispute also the issues of pedagogy, which is related to conditions of work and the health of workers. These are all pedagogical issues, and that affect the learning teaching process. And so working in these areas of pedagogy helps us to engage a broader sector of society in supporting our movement for public education. And but of course, when we're facing governments of the right, it's even, you can have the best program and it's still hard to get action. And so that's why we need to involve also in politics to ensure that we have governments in power that are open and willing to listen to us. And so in this, we connect our protests or fights for rights with the broader society for structural changes. And so that we always take this into account whenever we're fighting, what we are fighting for, and we tightly relation that with conditions in the classroom, learning conditions for students, and its benefit not just for teachers, but for students and for society in general. Thank you, Eduardo. Jackson, do you have any observations you'd like to share on that? The question that was made about how, in the first panel, about how to link the different organizations in Latin America, and the question of Cisa Picare around strengthening the teachers' unions. And then Eduardo was touching on the importance of the political projection of teachers' union. Jackson, do you have any observations on those?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the political context has a huge difference and impact on what we can do, what we struggle for, what we struggle against. So agree very much with Eduardo about those conditions being very critical to determining our strategy. I think Cisa asks a very good question. And one way we addressed it, and it's probably different, I imagine, in Ecuador and other countries with less infrastructure. But, you know, because our members had computers and internet, we were able to hold meetings across the entire membership using Zoom, and we had the best attendance of any meetings we've had in our history, in part because people were home. And so it became a daily strategy session rather than a monthly one that we would normally have in person, because of these conditions that actually increased, I think, the connection, participation in some ways. But it's still a poor substitute. I think Cisa is getting to that in her question. And I think that's why we need to demand vaccine access. You know, we should in Chicago be demanding that we send our vaccines to you in Honduras and to those of you in Ecuador, so that you can begin meeting in person again, because it is a poor substitute. We will suffer eventually by meeting remotely. We can't capture the same details. We don't listen as carefully. We don't understand the comments or context as well. We don't pay attention. So it's very difficult. And I do think, you know, we have to figure out ways around it, even if it means meeting outside with masks on. That can be better than continuing to do this as people get exhausted and stop connecting through these different means.
Compañero Gary.
Thanks.
Gary?
Thanks. I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous members and Indigenous communities in Ontario. Just a very quick history. 3.5 years ago, Ontario elected a conservative government. And the first thing they did was to end a revision of our curriculum across kindergarten to grade 12 that would infuse Indigenous content and Indigenous learnings into the curriculum. And I sat at a Ministry of Education table prior to this election, where we as a union were supportive of these changes. The province was consulting Indigenous elders, knowledge keepers, on what to do, and we were on a good path, and the new government came in and just stopped it. Now, slowly it's starting to come back as the government heard loud and clear how that was a bad move, especially with Canada going through a truth and reconciliation process. And some of you may have heard in the last year the discovery of bodies of Indigenous children underneath what used to be residential schools that were run by the church and the state. A very sad and terrible, absolutely terrible chapter in our history that has been, that Indigenous peoples knew about and told us about, but we refused to sort of acknowledge until now. So there's been a lot of change in that regard. And what that has done too is galvanized a lot of our members who are from Indigenous communities, and our federation has been engaged with the government consistently, supporting all of the recommendations that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I wanted to acknowledge that. In the rural areas, we've seen how it's galvanized support across the union in our rural areas because the issue of online learning and poor internet access. What's actually, the government continued to claim, oh, we built the infrastructure, it's going to be better, and it hasn't. And strangely enough, even in our urban centers, internet access has been problematic. You can imagine in a city like Toronto, where you have a building with 1,000 units in it, so many of which that have families, and all going online through the same line during the day, and a lot of internet issues. But for our rural members, we've seen more engagement throughout this pandemic. The last thing I'll say, though, we've come out with an education platform, our federation, because we have an election in Ontario coming up in June, and our goal is to get rid of this Conservative government that has only sought to destroy public education and privatize it as much as they can, even though they claim that they are full supporters of public education. Our platform, we took some lessons, I'll say, from my comrade in Chicago, Jackson, and what CTU has done, what Los Angeles teachers have done. We got away from a platform that would just focus on us as educators, as the union. What do we need? Instead, we have focused a platform that says what's good for public education, but also for our communities. We're calling for things like a universal basic income, better childcare, permanent sick days. That's been a major issue in our province and in the country, where unless you belong to a union, you have no access to sick days. And so we've called for those kinds of things. So we're starting. That's been our call for in this platform, and we hope that it's looking at building not just better public education system, but better communities with public education at the heart of it. And our members, they told us that's what they wanted. We consulted communities, that's what they wanted to see from us. So that's been a good unifying source for our membership recently, and we're hoping that we're able to get rid of this government.
Gracias, Gary.
Thank you, Gary. If there are any other participations, the participants, raise your hand. Thank you for the responses from the speakers. Excellent illustrations of different experiences. We have seen how the political context has a big difference on what we can achieve in the labor process. We hope that in Honduras we can improve. We say that we're getting close to the end of the dictatorship. 28th of November, we have elections where we're hoping to remove a hard right government that's been in power since the 2009 coup. But we fear that the dictatorship will not give up power so quickly. If there are no more questions, we'll revise the chat. Can I say something? There was one part from Cisa's question that I did not respond to. Education International, Latin America section, of which Cetera belongs to, has a intercultural network that is preparing its fourth encounter of Indigenous educators. There's been a lot written of concrete proposals to develop not just at the school level, but also in demands for specifically for bilingual intercultural education, because often they're left isolated or it's a very marginalized portion of the public education system. So in the Education International Latin America, we have been active in promoting this network. But as Cisa said, it's really an area that under these conditions, current conditions of the pandemic, has really been left isolated. And I also want to support what the compañera from a week after the coup in Honduras, we visited Honduras, and it was really clear to us how teachers were on the front line of resisting the coup and have worked ever since to try and return a democratic and popular government to that country. Thank you, Eduardo. And we ask everyone to keep an eye on us in our election on the 28th of November. I'm going to ask Maria Ramos to help me to read out if there's any questions from Facebook or I do see one question from the compañera Linda Morales. She had a question that Eduardo had said that there are 30,000 new positions added to visit students in their homes. Were those new positions created of teachers, or was this were this just a reassignment of existing positions? The majority were new hires. There were teachers that were hired to attend to students that didn't have access to internet or Wi-Fi. Most of them were students in their final year of teaching training. And so they received the sort of basic salary that teachers start with, and they were hired for the year when we were online, doing online education. And for us, it was a very important policy because it was a way to recognize the gap in terms of access to internet. And to be able to provide that social right of education despite the sort of technology gap that exists in our society. And so it was a duty of the state to attend to those youth that didn't have access to technology or internet. And it was a state policy, but we supported it. So it was something that took place for a year until they moved back into the classrooms. It really does show the difference it has when you have a government that recognizes the importance of investing in public education and to address issues of poverty and the gaps that exist. Maria, are there any questions in Facebook? In chat, we only had that question from Linda Morales. I think Maria is not in the room, but in the chat, there's only that one question that Linda made, and we don't have any other questions. Not in Facebook. Oh, it looks like Maria is back. I'm sorry, I was in the other session. This group is finished now then? We were just seeing if there were any questions from
Recording
Facebook.
Stopped.
No, we don't have any questions in Facebook. So the sessions, they have finished in the other ones. So maybe we can answer to if you want to read the question, and then we can return to the yes, because they're returning from the other groups now. So we can now close. So we move to the closing plenary. And so Gary and Eduardo and Jackson, if you want to say anything to conclude, starting with Eduardo, we just need to reiterate that under the context of this terrible pandemic that has affected all of humanity, that Latin American teaching, I'm not sure, I can't speak for United States and Canada, but I expect so, that the International for Education in Latin America have reiterated its commitment to fight for public education and to guarantee access for all children to education. And so despite the attack of the right in many countries, teachers in our continent have really shown themselves to be up to the task of defending education, defending their students, and defending their labor rights, and bringing education to all youth. And so to continue to depend on this, bet on this commitment, and thinking of a transformative, emancipating education. If for 2 years we were almost closed in our classroom or in our houses, we've heard of the talk about the sort of common sense. We have been able to meet and get together again. We've been able to reconnect ourselves, and there's still much work to do, much work ahead. If we want to transform Latin America, which is our dream, to reach that great country, that great common country. And so until the next time, I hope that the next time we get together, we can have a face-to-face forum like this and share the hugs that we all deserve. And Gary, I don't know if you have anything you want to say to conclude.
No, I think it's been covered really well, except to say that, what I'm hearing from other countries, there's a lot of similarities, even in Canada, where you might think things are going okay. Yeah, we may have a higher vaccination rate than some countries, but I share Jackson's comments about how we've seen vaccines go to waste here because they haven't been used, and why haven't we sent them to other countries that need them to support, especially educators who could use them so that we can get schools open and stay open, and help them and help students and staff stay safe from this pandemic. So thank you for having me again, and I hope my words were provided some learning today.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the participation. Applause to all the participants. And we're going to pass to the plenary. Maria. Thank you, compañera Fidel. And we have Edgar Ish here from the Central University of Ecuador, and from the Researchers Network of IDEA Network. And so this session passes to him. And I need to say, but pretty well, one of the other panels still hasn't incorporated, but I think we can begin. Thank you, Maria. I think they are finishing the tables, the other workshops now. So to all the compañeros y compañeras, it's a pleasure to have you here. We have had 3 workshops that have been very stimulating. The first was the student-teacher struggles in times of pandemic. And the final one was on technology and education. We're going to invite the different panelists to share, or the different workshops to share. So in this way, we would like to ask for the synthesis from the different workshops, 5-minute synthesis. So that we can keep them and have them prepared for our report on it. From table 2, of which we began, talked about the situation and conditions in the situation of return, and that was managed by Paul Velasquez. Paul, do you want to take over?
Thank you very much, Edgar. It is pretty difficult to try to summarize everything that we saw just in 5 minutes. Our group had many coincidences. I have tried to summarize as much as possible everything that all my colleagues mentioned. Hopefully, I share everything that we covered. I will try to present this individually, and then I'll share with you the collective conclusions. We started with Eduardo Pereira, and his contribution was very clear. He talked about the organization they have to go back. Argentina had to move to the virtual process. He talked about the anxiety of professors had for the kids who did not have virtual tools. And they talked about the social differences in Argentina. There was labor burden. The teaching process lasted all day long, and he shared social dialogue. And the discourse on equal conditions, they talked about the great value of teachers' work. They also guaranteed the salaries of teachers. He talked about also right to disconnection. So they had a specific number of hours working. They delivered 60,000 booklets for all those students who did not have virtual tools to be able to study. They also talked about the addition of 30,000 professors more to teach. Then we listened to our peer Jackson Potter from Chicago. He talked about the fact that schools closed by March. Then they went back to school this year on a hybrid fashion, mainly with a preschool students, like pre-kindergarten. He talked that there was resistance on behalf of certain teachers, basically because of students' connectivity. He talked about kindergarten professors being disciplined because they did not want to go back to schools. And they did not want to go back to school because they did not have the right conditions to go back. Despite the fact they faced new challenges on face-to-face teaching, there are some students that do not have access to computers, that the state did not help them. And he said that hybrid conditions at present achieved, in some cases, the right conditions to go back to face-to-face education. Jackson also added the fact that they had debate to the right of life as a main topic more than an economic topic. He also talked about the fact that the United States is still considered a threat to the world due to ultra-right people such as Trump and all the policies they are applying within the United States, and especially in the economic conditions of the United States. Then we listened to Gary Fan from Canada. He basically talked about Ontario's perspective. He mentioned that struggles of everyone on returning back to school were very similar to the rest of the countries. He said that governments did not help low-income students. Teachers had to make a big effort to be able to go back to schools. He said that September last year, schools reopened, despite the fact that there were demands on behalf of some teachers for there to be the sanitary conditions, filters to sanitize the air and enhance conditions, having more ventilation. Many conditions were never met. Therefore, some schools had to close their doors and then reopen. He also shared an experience because some schools had to close 3 times. He talked about a labor law in which they talk about safe conditions to cancel work, but for that they need the approval of a labor inspector. Despite the fact that they have the possibility of canceling classes by this inspector, chances were very low. He also said that kids from 12 to 18 years old are entitled to receiving vaccines. He also said that some teachers lasted 5 years to be vaccinated, 5 months, to get vaccinated. They asked for the right conditions for students to go back to school, such as sanitation, material, masks, etc. And they also said that they did not comply with proper distance between students. However, better conditions were achieved by means of the union. A few months before the pandemic, the professors were fighting for a collective contract that had been signed in the midst of pandemic. So when a new debate on a collective contract starts, they will receive different support from the society. Lastly, Cisa Bakari posed a question to all the speakers in which she wanted to know about how to enhance collective speakers' contribution. And all of the speakers entertained the question by talking about some experiences with the union and the government and the position of the government. He said that if Macri had not been empowered, they would have never achieved these fundamental changes that they achieved, and that they were able to fight not only for professors' fight, but for a new system. Jackson also presented something very similar. He talked about conditions for strategy, during which they used something very similar to what Eduardo mentioned. They have carried out very important assemblies on a virtual mode. And Gary Fenn talked about a very important experience that has to do with the contribution of the members that are Indigenous in Ontario and how the government tried to hide Indigenous teachers, but the population, based on some social and political aspects, found out some places in which the students had been buried. Therefore, the contribution of Indigenous professors has been improved. Conclusions on behalf of Eduardo was to grant the right to education despite the pandemic. This has applied in the whole of Latin America. Gary mentioned that concerns about vaccination are really serious. He also said that sometimes vaccines expired without being used amongst the professors. I believe I did not leave anything out. Hopefully, I did not leave anyone outside of this conclusion. And your microphone is off, Edgar. Apologies. Paul, thank you very much. This is of great interest. Now we can get to know what was in the debate. Thank you for being so concise. Thank you for your summary. It is difficult, but it is necessary for us to do this. So now we have another 5 minutes for the next rapporteur. We'll talk about pandemic, technology, and education rights. The rapporteur will be on behalf of Pablo Garduño. He is a member of Modern Times in Mexico. He's a student. Pablo, go ahead, please. Hello, good afternoon to all of you. It is a bit difficult to make a summary in the best possible way due to time restrictions and due to technical difficulties. Sometimes I do not have enough internet speed here to follow the pace of the assembly. I'm having some problems to read the document that I wrote during the session, but I will make the best of efforts. And I rescued some of the main ideas. Within our group, we had the contribution of 3 peers, right? Larry Cohen from BTCF Canada, Lalila Andrade from the Strato Network of Canada as well, and Roberto Herrera, a professor from Ecuador. The presentation of Larry Cohen was about capitalism and education platforms during the pandemic. And he talked about emphasizing and going deeper into what he mentioned during his first contribution about the market and about surveillance pedagogy, all the risks around compiling students' data and users' data, professors, students, and families, based on the main applications and platforms that have been imposed in this remote teaching modality, and the platforms, applications, and services that supplement this virtual education, such as browsers in general, such as Google and YouTube browsers and other browsers. He also talked about surveillance pedagogy, and he also talked about the influence in future behavior of students and the users in general. This peer presented one of the premises that was present throughout the whole session, the idea that technology is not neutral. So Mr. Larry exposed this, but not only him, but the other 2 speakers also talked about this. Talking about the Lila's presentation, she mainly talked about some data on a survey carried out by her peers over there in Canada. And she said that disparities were much more exacerbated due to the pandemic. This led to a serious access gap and follow-up gap in education.
So it had to do with the technology, with the conditions as well. And it also had to do with some economic gaps, health gaps. And she also spoke about the new difficulties that educational workers were facing, not only by an increase of the workload, but also because of the health problems that this new modality of work has caused. The fact that we are all day long sitting on a chair connected to computers affecting our vision, our spine, etc. So, and during Roberto's presentation, he emphasized the fact that in the southern part of the continent, that is where the gaps are bigger because of our historical background. He also gave us some statistics about how the inequalities grew in the life of Ecuadorians. He spoke about the fact that more than 10% of the total population fell under the line of poverty or extreme poverty, with 1.8 million people. He spoke about the economic, social, and educational crisis, and how there were some massive layoffs, budgetary cutdowns. There was a deficient infrastructure investment and education policies that did not really meet the needs. He spoke about some of the facts that were worsened because of the pandemic. And he also brought to the table several ideas. He actually kicked off the debate around the fact that whether in Latin American countries or the countries that, according to the OECD, we should consider as developing nations, he kicked off that debate by asking whether we should be open or closed to the adoption of technology, knowing full well that it's not neutral and it is owned by big companies, the big consortiums. Could you please wrap it up? Yes, sorry. So we reached some conclusions. For instance, the debate is not around whether we should accept or not technology. The technology is there, but rather we should be asking who's benefiting whom. And if it's for a project to liberate the peoples, then it's not something that we should reject. But if it's reproducing the same capital inequality, then that's where we should resist. That's basically what we discussed in our table. I apologize it took so long. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you for this summary of the first day of this event, which has truly gone very well. So now we have 5 minutes for a last presentation of the panel that was working about the teachers and students' fights during the time of the pandemic to reflect certain experiences. The rapporteur was Verónica de Heredia from the Trinational Coalition in Defense of Public Education. So Verónica, the floor is all yours, please.
Okay, muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Primero que nada, de algún elemento.
First of all, if I miss out on something, please correct me. As Edgar has said, we still have tomorrow so that we can fine-tune anything that is necessary. But anyway, in the table, we had the participation on the one hand of Sister Sabine, the president of UNDE from Ecuador. We also had Marvin, the executive secretary of ECLA, and the president of COVEN, Professor William. there were two subjects that were very mainstream in all of the presentations and all the comments. One of them had to do with the fact of unity in the fight of teachers and students. In this case, some examples were given around Honduras or Mexico or Nicaragua, British Columbia, of current fights and resistance towards the pandemic, but also from a historical perspective, we spoke about the importance of this relationship in there's a need to come up with a common front to face the power, to defend public education, and also to fight for the education we wish to have. Another subject that was discussed by all of the presentations had to do with the one that is related to the guild's interests. Because the Teachers Guild has certain interests that are very much our own. Educational workers have their own, and we share some, and there are certain overlaps, and that is why these guilds have to work together with other social groups, social organizations, and to join broader fights, broader resistance, like in the case of Isabel, when she spoke about the resistance during the pandemic in the defense of resisting NOAA, and now how a big fight is coming their way because of budgetary restrictions, and how they have also created alliances with other groups to defend human rights. In the case of Colombia, we heard about the state of education and how their current fight is around how to enforce agreements that were achieved recently in Colombia, and now that they're also facing the elections in 2022, which is going to be important for them, and also human rights violations that are happening in their context and that need to be addressed. Those were the matters that were very much mainstream in all the presentations. And so how the interests of our guilds can have a dialogue with national interests or other social groups' interests, and how we can strike alliances to globalize not only the resistance at the national level for all workers, but bring it to international plane. Because we are all facing precarious working conditions. This is something that's also being globalized. Some examples were given about the situation in which this experience has happened in Honduras, Mexico, and about the need for students, like in this case at the university levels, if they could work together with teachers, so that in Mexico right now, people who have presented the fight to defend public education during the pandemic have been the students or students in teachers' schools. And in the case of Nicaragua, Marvin told us about how there's been a consolidation of the defense of public education in a project in Nicaragua. It is a broader national project that started from the coordination of students' organizations as well as educational groups, along with the alliances with other social groups. In this experience of Unidad in Colombia is expressed in the creation of a national strike committee, as William has explained, how the youth has been strongly supporting, and this was a learning of political relationship towards unions, but also how to work together and respecting the diversity that is being organized. So in general terms, those were the elements that were discussed during our table. Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. So our three rapporteurs, two male, one female rapporteur of the tables, have given us a very important contribution for this event. because in terms of the content and also in the effort of summarizing things that have been said, summarizing, filtering, condensing, this is a way in which we can start coming up with some basic ideas, because don't forget that tomorrow we want to come up with a declaration, a political declaration, so that we come up with a stand. And so the summary is the raw material for us to construct that document, such as we had in the initial panel, as well as the one we'll have tomorrow. So we are open to all of your feedback, the feedback from the presenters, the feedback from the attendees, brothers and sisters who could have an idea of specific things that need to be incorporated in this political declaration. Please send them our way so that we can incorporate them. So what we have discussed today confirms, ratifies some elements, will renew, and is shedding light on some others. On the one hand, this is a very specific historic time that is different from the past. In our continent, we have a reloaded neoliberalism, but at the same time, it is one that it is morphing, adapting to new conditions. It is transforming its discourse and the ways in which it is reaching or applying the so famously called the Washington Consensus. Capitalism has not changed, neoliberalism has not changed, but they change their appearance, they shed their skins, they change certain fashions, tools, ways of operating, technologies. So therefore, we are forced to realize that all rights are being weakened, human rights, the rights of children, the rights of the youngsters, the rights of workers, all human rights are under attack, the rights of teachers, evidently. Education is now being threatened by different dangers that come from those policies. Privatization is one aspect, but privatization that is expressed in different ways, which at the end of the day is all about putting education at the service of who? The ruling, the hegemonic classes. But there's also a threat that is bigger. Education is threatened by the way in which technologies shape the way in which we educate, as Larry Quinn has explained. And at the same time, those elements, they have changed, or they intend to change so as to be considered as common sense, to be normalized. We resist to the fact that the thinking cannot be standardized, and teachers, we are not servants of this unique type of standardized thinking. And just as neoliberalism has considered the changes, the transformations, and everything, it is also true that teachers, men and women who work in the educational field, we have known how to respond with new ways. First, to adapt to this very abrupt change from face-to-face to remote teaching. And secondly, so that in both arenas, digital and remote, we could act in such a way that we can confront the hegemonic positioning. This is very important. Teachers are not passive. We are not passive. We're not just obedience and just stagnant. We are in a search. We are rebelling, and we are willing to pick up a fight. Therefore, we are ratifying, we are remembering the main subject of our subject matter today, to have an education that is based in human relationships in which rights are honored. So we should not only mention them, but we should live by them constantly. Technology has to be put at the service of humanity and not the other way around. Technology has to be rendered at the service of the majorities instead of the few powerful ones. This alternative type of education, this education that should be public education, which is meant to transform the world, as our motto says, it has to be created. We need to weave it. This is the place, not the only one. There are some other people from other groups that are also doing the same thing. We're all weaving together. And we should feel happy about that. We should think about how to work with them so that we can come up with a common quilt, common fabric that could cover all of us. So there are different initiatives of different value, and they are being our compass for pedagogical thinking. It's not the only one, but it is one that is serving us because it is aligned to Paulo Freire's ideals. And that is important because it means that from the pedagogical perspective, we also have the possibility of approaching one another, collaborating, integrating efforts. So we need to work with the thinking and also with the actions. We need to go to the fight and to the political arena.
Necesitamos que esa politización esté soportada, esté apoyada en un pensamiento pedagógico que sea en realidad popular. De aquí salen muchas propuestas concretas. Yo quiero hablar de 3 órbitas en las que estamos hablando entonces. La una tiene que ver con la necesidad de coordinar cada vez más nuestra acción en estos terrenos. La segunda, con el hecho de que requerimos combinar lucha y propuesta, pero la lucha en sí mismo es una propuesta. Volvamos a Freire. El maestro educando también está, digamos, el maestro luchando también está educando. Y esto debe ser altamente considerado. Es una lucha por derechos. En nuestro caso, por supuesto, el derecho a la educación es un derecho fundamental, pero no está separado del derecho a la salud, no está separado de los derechos laborales. Estamos hablando en realidad
Edgar
de
y
una
Claudia,
lucha...
tenemos un problema con la traducción. Edgar y Claudia, tenemos un problema. Viendo el inglés. Oh, Sara dijo cambia el canal de traducción. Bueno, perdón. Disculpa.
Tal vez en inglés.
All right, so maybe you would understand me better in English. Probably, that could be. All right, apologies. So I'm just closing. I was telling you that the thing here is work conditions. We're talking about the community, the education community. It's not only the teacher, the professor, it's the labor conditions of the student, the boys, the girls, the teens. So to which schoolrooms should we go back? Under which conditions? But above all, with what pedagogy will we go back? The struggle that exists in Latin America, in which they comply with very important roles, international of education and the different organizations, towards a pedagogical movement which is alternate. That is a very significant line of action that we may not set aside. So we have the possibilities of analyzing the current situation. We are obliged to establishing what to do, because alternate education will always have to do with changing the world, and we also have the task of establishing how to do it, how to make this change in our educational world. And all of these is the conclusion of all the breakout rooms of the plenary session and of other moments in time and other events. With this, I'd like to conclude today without forgetting that tomorrow we will have another session, and Maria is going to give us instructions for tomorrow's session. Thank you very much, Edgar. We have all the reports and all the information for the declaration that we will share with all of you tomorrow. We want to thank you very much because in the ending session, the Colombian Federation of Professors and the National Union of Educators are mobilized today as well. So this is part of what the context is establishing. So William Belandia, we want to thank you very much for this effort. We want to thank the chair of the National Group of Educators, Ms. Vargas. We want to thank every single peer who made this dialogue possible. This dialogue is made up of all the continent's members. We want to thank absolutely everyone for their very significant contributions. Marvin, Antonio, we also thank you as a representative of OCLAE. It's very important to have the Latin American students movement. This is very important for all of us. And we also want to thank Jackson Potter from Chicago Union and Larry Fenn from the junior high group in Ontario. We also want to thank Dalila Andrade from the Studies Network on Teaching Work, Mr. Roberto Herrera from the University of Cotopaxi, and Larry King from the CP Network, and the British Columbia Teachers Federation. Our moderators from Section 18, Jose Raciel. We know what all these mobilizations mean to you. We know how important it is for you to take some time in your agenda to help us. Thank you, Fidel Garcia, Chair of the School of Professors, Middle School Professors. Thank you for your solidarity. Thank you for your support. And thank you for this hug that you give to all of us in Latin America. And of course, we want to thank Maria de la Luz Arriaga, coordinator of the first conference. Paul Bucky, we also thank you from QP Canada. You enrich us. And we want to thank you for the invitation for tomorrow. Thank you, Edgar, for summoning us. Tomorrow we will have further discussions, and we want to thank the technical team who's helping us as well for this work to be possible. We want to apologize for some technical issues that we faced when we changed the panels. Thank you for your patience. Now, talking about the work to be done tomorrow. Tomorrow, we will start talking about the alternatives based on pedagogical practices, based on different experiences from north to south. We will see tomorrow how we can build all of these alternatives. Tomorrow, you can check your program, but tomorrow we will have a very rich contribution on behalf of several countries of this continent: Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Canada, Mexico, El Salvador, Chile. So please do not miss tomorrow's session. It will be even better than today's. We have a very interesting material already. We will be connected to the same link. So the link you received at your email address will be the same link for tomorrow. The time will be the same, and tomorrow we will be working in the SEPA network room. Just to remind you, we will have bilingual sessions, English, Spanish, Spanish, English. So please invite your colleagues to join us. Invite your friends. The session is open to everyone. Now, the rapporteurs, please send us your reports. We want to thank our panel members, and we want to ask you to share in writing everything you presented today. On my behalf, that will be all. I want to thank you all for attending this session. We want to thank Mr. Eduardo Pereira from Argentina. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you for accompanying us. And without further ado, I want to thank you for this session. Let's continue weaving these networks that allow us to think of a different education, that allows us to think that there are alternative education types. Let's continue strengthening the bond that join us. Thank you very much. Have a very good evening. Thank you all. Thank you all the attendees. Have a good night. Thank you, and see you tomorrow. Greetings from Honduras. Greetings to all of you. You are very kind. Thank you. Greetings from Colombia. Goodbye.
Desde Ecuador, muchas gracias. Gracias desde Panamá.
Ay, maestra, no le cambiamos el nombre y aparecía como María.
Thank you. We apologize to you because we did not change your name. We did not rename you.
Mire, estuvo toda la